This Sunday, the book of Exodus, chapter 1, beginning with verse 1, the word of the Lord is as follows. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God, did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Thus far, the word of the Lord. This is an autopsy of an insurrection, part 5.2. 5.2. Having identified lawlessness, nationalism, pastoral accommodation, and political calculation as climatic contributions to the January 6th insurrection, on last Sunday we observed the fifth factor to be that of othering fostered by xenophobic and racist sentiments. The past 5 years were filled with the weaponization of race and xenophobia through the continual assertion of non-whites as the other to be feared, distrusted, and displaced. There has been the feeding upon the nativist sentiments, particularly the nativist sentiments of whites, as insiders and ethnic and racial minorities, both resident and immigrant, as other and outsider. Last week, we addressed the matter from the standpoint of immigration, where we affirmed God's call for God's people to be pro-immigrant, which is the call to displaying openness exemplified by hospitable generosity, exemplifying a commitment to equity and justice for the immigrant, shifting the view of the immigrant from being other than to being one of, and offering an inclusive love informed by an appreciation of our own history with the sovereign God. We noted that while othering is a global phenomenon, the primary American manifestation has its roots in white supremacy, which elevates whiteness above all others. This view forces every other non-white into the category of other than. The elevation of whiteness places whiteness as the norm, the standard, the goal, the legitimate, and the good. And for people of color, success is tied to the assimilation to and approximation of whiteness. Hence, assimilation and proximity to whiteness becomes a frustrating pursuit for people of color because no matter how close you may come, there are multiple reminders that you still aren't white. It does not matter how much you achieve, how many hoops you go through, there will be reminders that you are black, that you are Hispanic, that you are Asian, that you are Native American, that you are Eastern Indian, that you are not white. The notion of whiteness is a particularly American construct. It comes into being in the 1670s, where the growth of the importance of slavery in the American economy required a means of describing those who were not black and those who were black. Those who were not black were not subject to enslavement. Those who were black were subject to enslavement. And a whole taxonomy in terms of how much of a drop of blood was in your bloodline was what was used to determine whether or not you were black or white. And so whiteness, the concept of whiteness comes about in terms of not black. It was initially applied to Anglo-Saxons and later would come to include Irish and Italians. And the social and legal codification of whiteness and white supremacy in America was then given intellectual cover in Germany in 1776 by Johann Blumenbach, who laid out the scientific template for race in his work entitled On the Natural Varieties of Mankind. He mapped a hierarchical pyramid of 5 human types, placing Caucasians at the top because he believed that he found a skull in the Caucasus Mountains in the area of Georgia. That's in that Ukrainian area. And he found it to be, quote, the most beautiful form of the skull from which the others diverge. The model was widely embraced, and Blumenbach inadvertently paved the way for scientific claims about white superiority. The notion of whiteness and white superiority is baked within the DNA of America. It predates America's founding. It's a part of that amniotic fluid that's been passed down from generation to generation. And it is this ideology in particular to which the former president appealed, and a significant percentage of people responded. The virulence of its expression, which reached its culmination on January 6th, is due to a combination of fear and ignorance. And my brothers and sisters, fear and ignorance are a deadly mix in the hands of an authoritarian personality. They become the means by which the authoritarian manipulates the masses by contriving an external threat to oppose. It's like coming down the escalator of Trump Tower and speaking about Mexicans as being rapists and violent. It appeals to stereotypes because absent of truth, stereotypes are upheld and fantasies are believed. And with that, the environment for the unimaginable is set. Such is the case in the text before us. Exodus gives us the continuation of the story of the children of Israel. Some 300 years have elapsed between the time of Joseph and Joseph's family migrating into Egypt. And chapter 1 opens towards the end of those 300 years. It begins by reminding us of those who originally journeyed into Egypt. And that catalog is done for the sake of preserving a faithful record. It seeks to provide a sense of rootedness and connectedness with generations long ago and with their God. The roll of the 12 sons of Jacob is called, and we are told of their entry into Egypt and of their subsequent deaths. Within 300 years, they were fruitful, They prospered, increased, and multiplied in the land of Goshen. God blessed them in said multiplication, not only to keep God's promise that was made all the way back to Abraham, but also to provide an adequate defense against physical attack. The children of Israel coexisted peacefully and harmoniously with the people of Egypt. They enjoyed the fruit of their labor. There was a mutual respect between the groups, due mainly to the remembrance and love of Joseph, and the covenant made between him and Pharaoh. But years proceed, people die out, and dynasties change. The 16th dynasty, which reigned under Joseph's term, and the Hyksos dynasty, which ruled immediately after Joseph, is now replaced by the 18th dynasty. And during the time of this dynasty, there arose a new king over Egypt. A new king, one to whom the vast amount of power was novel, one who had not been king before, who had yet to dwell secure within his newfound place of power. This new king does not know Joseph. He does not consider, does not understand, does not observe Joseph with a purpose, does not know the history, does not know the contributions, does not recognize the value of Joseph's interpreting the dreams of an earlier Pharaoh who warned him of 7 years of plenty, which would be followed by 7 years of famine. He's unaware of Joseph's skillful management of Egypt's prosperity that prepared it for its time of scarcity and how it maintained Egypt's prominence in the world. He chose to be unfamiliar with his predecessor's covenant with Joseph, saying, "The land of Egypt is before you. The best of the land make your father and your brothers to dwell." This Pharaoh was ignorant. The power of Joseph's influence and sway upon Egyptians' current place was not understood by this Pharaoh. It had dissipated. The significance in the development of and maintenance of Egypt was tied to Joseph and Joseph's people. And because this new king did not regard Joseph, he does not regard Joseph's people. He knows nothing of their history, of their heritage, of their culture. He has no appreciation for their contributions and their peaceful coexistence. Because he does not know, he exists in a state of falsehood. He does not possess the truth which would allow him to operate from a place of reality. And friends, that's the danger when you don't have truth. Because the absence of truth sets the stage for deception and manipulation. Pharaoh's ignorance of Joseph and Joseph's people causes him to view Joseph's people and their multiplication in a particular way. He notices that they are multiplying more rapidly and that their numbers have now exceeded that of the Egyptians, and in his insecurity and ignorance, he falsely anticipates their joining with Egypt's enemies and leaving the country, or worse, overthrowing Egypt. He therefore begins to view them as enemies rather than allies, threats rather than assets. Had Pharaoh known the truth, he would have known that they were a peaceful people. He would have known that they viewed their relationship with Egypt in terms of collaborative interdependence rather than confrontation and conquest. But because he did not possess the truth, because he was ignorant, he was not balanced in his perception. He was deceived by his own ignorance and insecurity. And therefore, a negative stereotype takes hold in his mind. He sees the Israelites as prone to violent uprising, which causes him now to fear. He has an emotional reaction based upon a mental anticipation of a perceived threat. There was no objective evidence of Israel collaborating with Egypt's enemies. Israel had not exhibited a contrary or warlike spirit. Pharaoh is under the influence of a lie. The combination of his personal insecurity and ignorance causes this false perception to grow larger and larger in his mind. You see, friends, the lack of truth is the breeding ground for uncertainty, which sets the stage for negative imagery to influence thought and behavior. And even right now, there are instances that have just flashed across your mind when you did not have the truth. And you're not knowing the truth bred uncertainty. And because our minds are often more prone to the fallen aspect, negative imagery comes up. And that negative imagery often, if left unchecked, influences our thoughts and our behavior, such as the power of innuendo, rumor, gossip, and outright lies. They operate on the basis of people who are ignorant, who do not know the truth, being fed negative images and words. And the more that those words and images are heard and seen, the more they are believed, not so much because they are true, but because they are frequent. And such has been the case here in America. The continued racism and xenophobia is undergirded by insecurity coupled with ignorance of historical and contemporary truth. There is an individual and collective anxiety among many, particularly many of our white brothers and sisters, concerning their place in America and their place in the world. The demographic shifts cause them to perceive themselves to be losing their position of the center of all things. The browning of America, the reality of the combined populations of people of color now becoming statistical majorities in many places across the United States have been sources of alarm for those who hold a white nationalist and white supremacist ideology. When you combine this with a shifting economy, where many manual labor jobs have disappeared due to technology and outsourcing overseas, the anxiety, the sense of dislocation, and even anger must have a place to be directed. Somebody has to be blamed. And historically, people of color and Jews have been the locus of misdirected anger and anxiety in America. Listen now to Pharaoh in verse 9. Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. This leader, driven by ignorance and insecurity, he now exports his personal fear and anxiety to the people of Egypt. He stokes their anxieties. He stirs up their insecurities. He seeks to co-locate the people of God as a threat in the people of Egypt's mind. It's the main message that he and his surrogates carry. It's heard on every Egyptian news outlet. And this is essential to his ultimate goal, which is to secure his base of power. Remember, this is a new king, one who is new in his role as Pharaoh. And he sees his security being tied to the Hebrews' subjugation. They got to be put in place. They got to be held in check. Egypt is under the threat of being overrun by Hebrews joining with Egypt's enemies. Egyptians will not have a country if they don't do something soon. And therefore, Pharaoh posits a shrewd way of dealing with the people. They got to be kept within Egypt because they have economic value. They could be a source of cheap and even free labor. But in order to do this, certain environmental factors have to be manipulated in such a way that they can control their population. And so Pharaoh says, we've got to wear them down, break their spirits, cause them to be emotionally and psychologically traumatized, put them in a state of deprivation, take something away from them. And therefore, taskmasters are placed over them, and they're deprived now of self-government. They're subject to the brutality of taskmasters who would beat them and increase their workload. They taunted them and paid them low wages and levied high taxes upon them, which put them in debt and at the mercy of Egypt. But they would go even further. Pharaoh tells the Hebrew midwives to kill the male children who were recently born. This was the wisdom of Pharaoh. In other translations, Pharaoh says, let us deal with them wisely. This was his twisted wisdom. This was what was acceptable to his conscience and spirit. This is what he presented to the Egyptian people for acceptance and implementation. And in their collective insecurity and ignorance, this is what they implement. Because, brothers and sisters, fear combined with ignorance is the environment where the unthinkable becomes acceptable. Such is the history of Native Americans, Mexicans, Africans, and their descendants in America. Such has been the case for Jews throughout Europe and in America. The unthinkable becomes acceptable. The unthinkable in Germany becomes acceptable by way of the Holocaust. The unthinkable by way of antebellum slavery and Jim Crow becomes acceptable in America. And such was the case on January the 6th. The unthinkable became actual and believed to be acceptable. The overtaking of the U.S. Capitol, the undermining of democracy, the attempt to overrun a duly certified election, that was unthinkable until January the 6th. Inflamed by the lie of a stolen election and the narrative of a lost country, thousands laid siege to the Capitol, disrupted the legal certification of the election, and sent senators and representatives, their staffs, and yes, even the Vice President of the United States, along with his family, into hiding for fear of their lives. The unthinkable became actual and was considered to be acceptable by the then President of the United States. Pharaoh's twisted thinking, driven by fear and ignorance, causes the unthinkable to be acceptable. But there was a problem with Pharaoh's thinking. His seeking to stop and to destroy Israel's multiplication revealed another layer of his ignorance. You see, their growth and multiplication was not simply the result of biology. Pharaoh's ignorance of Joseph and Joseph's people was also an ignorance of the God whom they served. He knew nothing of their history with God, of God's promise to Abraham to make his seed as numerous as the sand on the shore and the stars in the sky. And therefore, in Pharaoh's attempt to confine the Israelites, to constrict the Israelites, to limit the Israelites, he displayed an ignorance of God telling Abraham that his seed would spread as far as the east is to the west and as far as the north is to the south. And therefore, Pharaoh's actions did not place him in opposition to Israel. No, his actions placed him in direct opposition to their God. He thought that he was just dealing with the Israelites, but in his ignorance, he was acting against the aspirations and designs of God for God's own people. You see, friends, othering undergirded by xenophobia and racism discounts the person and purposes of God. It is not just against the people, it is against the purposes that God has for the existence and well-being of the people. The text alerts us that though they were taunted and burdened and oppressed, they were not broken. The more that they were oppressed, the more that they multiplied. because Pharaoh did not understand that affliction is not too hard for God. That God has a way of working with afflictions to accomplish his purposes. Had he known Joseph, he would have known Joseph telling his brothers, what you did, you meant for evil. But God meant it for good to save those who are alive. God is the God who works in the midst of afflictions. God is the God who works within even the malignant and malevolent intentions of others to fulfill his good and acceptable and perfect will on their behalf. God is the God that would cause his people to sing the testimony, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth them out of them all. And well, somebody is raising your hand and saying, thank you, Jesus, because you know that in the midst of the afflictions through which you've gone, the Lord has worked them for your good. You're able to talk about how you now are able to glory in your tribulation, because you found out that tribulation works patience, and patience works experience, and experience works hope, and hope has caused you not to be ashamed because the love of God has been shed abroad in your heart by way of the Holy Spirit. You know of instances where the enemy thought that he had you, was going to destroy you, and God literally used what the enemy meant for your destruction, and God used it for your very advancement. Well, Pharaoh had no regard for Joseph or Joseph's God. Watch this now. It's in the story. The Hebrew midwives did. Pharaoh instructs the Hebrew midwives, if it's a male child, kill him. But the Bible says that the Hebrew midwives feared the Lord. Oh, Lord, have mercy. They knew something about God's power. They knew God to be greater than Pharaoh. And even though they were under Pharaoh's employ, even though their positions were subject, my God, to experiencing negative consequences, these women had enough truth in them to have the courage to refuse to harm the Hebrew children, because they knew the truth. They knew the truth about God, and they knew God to be greater than Pharaoh. They knew that every child that God brought into the world was a child of value, filled with purpose and meaning. Friends, God is calling for the church to show the courage and wisdom of the midwives. He's calling for a fear of God that will prompt a public courage, that will prompt a commitment to the truth. In the midst of othering fostered by xenophobic and racist sentiments that are undergirded by fear and ignorance, God is saying to the church, you've got to be armed with the truth about God, the truth about God's purposes for all of humanity, the truth about everyone being created in the image and likeness of God, and part of the Imago Dei means that you have personhood and that you have the right to belong. God says, I need for you as the church to bear witness to the truth of his work in the histories of all people. You want to know why we have to have Black History for a month? It's because not just black people need to know the history, but white people need to know the history. Everybody needs to know the history of what has gone on with black people in America, because all of America has benefited by the story and the history of blacks in America. There would be no Immigration Act of 1965 had there not been a Civil Rights Act in 1964. There would not have been the opening of the gates had there not been black folk who struggled for there to be the establishment of civil rights. You got to know the history, and we've got to be able to tell the history and the truth about the evil of racism, the evil of xenophobia, the truth about God's love for all, and God's desire for shalom for all, God's desire for well-being for all. And as the midwives knew the truth, and as they acted on the truth, the church has to be seen acting acting on the truth. Our call is not just to truth tell. Ours is to truth do. Doing truth, not just speaking truth to power, but doing truth against the misuse of power. God calls us to this very ministry in this nation at this time. And friends, the courage to speak the truth, the courage to do the truth in the midst of fear and ignorance, watch this now, aligns you with the God whose truth cannot be ignored, whose power cannot be withstood, and whose purposes cannot be frustrated or denied. I'm trying to help somebody. When you do the truth, when you speak the truth, when you live the truth, it aligns you with the God whose truth cannot be ignored, whose power cannot be withstood, and whose purposes cannot be frustrated or denied. Watch now, with the midwives refusing, my God, to obey Pharaoh, with their choosing to do the truth concerning the Hebrew male children, God is able to work. God works with a woman who has a boy by the name, who has a boy, and the woman's name is Jochebed, and she sees this boy to be a beautiful child filled with God purpose, and she takes the revolutionary step to put her boy in an ark of bulrushes and put him on the Nile River. God then navigates the ark down the Nile and into the lagoon of Pharaoh's daughter. God puts compassion in the heart of Pharaoh's daughter, causing her to adopt this boy as her own and give him the name of Moses. God then orchestrates it so that Moses is then nursed by his mother Jochebed while educated and trained as a prince of Egypt. God then moves upon his heart, causing him to look at the affliction of his people and choose to suffer their affliction rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. God takes him now to the plains of Midian, calls him on the backside of a mountain called Oreb, speaks to him through a bush that is burned but not consumed, tells him the truth about who he is, commissions him to return to Egypt with one message: let my people go. And in case they need my credentials, you just tell them, I am that I am. Now see Moses armed with the truth of his God, declaring to Pharaoh, the Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go. In other words, Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, it might have been all right to ignore Joseph, to ignore our people, to even ignore our history, but as Moses stands there declaring, thus says the Lord, Moses says, you cannot ignore our God. He is the I am that I am. He is the Lord whose glory the heavens declare and whose handiwork the firmament shows. Day utters speech and night shows forth knowledge, and there is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. And then God says, I'll make myself known. All I need for you to do is be willing to speak the truth and do the truth when I direct you, and I'll take care of the rest. I'll make myself known in ways that nobody can ignore. Over against the determination of Pharaoh, motivated by his fear and ignorance, God says, let me assert my truth and display my power and fulfill my purpose. He turns the Nile River into blood. He brings gnats and locusts upon the earth. He causes frogs and murrain and boils to come upon the land. He makes, my God, hail to descend and turn to fire once it strikes the ground. He brings cosmic darkness upon the face of the earth. And then he says, I got one more move. He sends a death angel to strike the firstborn in Egypt that did not have the blood of the lamb upon the doorpost. The God who is God is the God whose truth cannot be ignored, whose power cannot be withstood, and whose purposes cannot be denied. God brings his people out of Egypt with their heads held up, and when Pharaoh pursues them and tries to take them back to Egypt, God says, I'll open up the Red Sea. He takes them across on dry ground. He takes them across the Jordan river on dry ground. He takes them past Jericho's high walls, and he brings them into the land of promise, just like he planned. He gave them cities that they did not build, wells that they did not dig, vineyards that they did not plant, because, friends, none can stop the Lord Almighty. History confirms that when you speak the truth, when you do the truth, it aligns you with the God whose truth cannot be ignored, whose power cannot be withstood, and whose purposes cannot be denied. Harriet Tubman's, Sojourner Truth's, Frederick Douglass's, William Lloyd Garrison, Abraham Lincoln's doing the truth. Align them with the God whose truth cannot be ignored, whose power could not be withstood, and whose purposes could not be denied. In overcoming antebellum slavery, Martin and Medgar, Malcolm and Rosa, Fannie Lou and A. Phillip, Roy and Whitney, Dorothy and Mary McLeod, and Thurgood doing truth. Align them with the God whose truth could not be ignored, whose power could not be withstood, and whose purpose could not be denied. In the dismantling of Jim Crow segregation, Desmond Tutu, Stephen Biko, Nelson Mandela, Alan Bosak, and others doing truth. Align them with the God whose truth cannot be ignored, whose power cannot be withstood, whose purpose cannot be denied. In overcoming South African apartheid, but can I just call up one more? And he's greater than them all. My God, he was born in a stable and grew up in the ghetto. His name is Jesus, the Word made flesh, who dwelt among us and revealed his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He came speaking truth. He came doing truth. In fact, he was and still is the truth against the powers of sin and Satan, against the powers of falsehood and fear, against the forces of hatred and hell. Jesus spoke, and Jesus did the truth in his living, in his preaching, in his teaching, and in his healing. The truth of God was displayed. The power of God was revealed, and the purpose of God was fulfilled. And every time they tried to confine him, my God, every time they tried to limit him, every time they tried to marginalize him, my God, he just kept on speaking truth, kept on doing truth, and the truth of God, my God, went on, and the power of God was displayed, and the purpose of God was fulfilled. And even when they thought that they had him, when they nailed him to a tree, when they hung him on the cross, they did not realize that even then the truth of God was displayed, the power of God was revealed, and the purpose of God was fulfilled. That when they hung him high and they stretched him wide, they were fulfilling the truth, because he had already told them, nobody takes my life, I lay it down willingly. He had already told them that if I be lifted up above the earth, I'll draw all men unto me. He had already told them that he was going to be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and then be crucified, because even as he hung on the cross, the truth of God was being revealed. The truth of our misery, the truth of our sinfulness, the truth of our depravity, it was met with the truth of God's love, the truth of God's mercy, the truth of God's justice, the truth of God's righteousness, the truth of God's grace. God's truth and God's power and God's purpose was seen at Calvary. A thief on the cross saw it all for himself and said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. A Roman soldier, he saw that truth, he saw that power, and said, surely this must be the Son of God. And it was displayed not just in his death, but even when he was buried and when he rose, overcoming sin, overcoming death, overcoming the grave. It was seen by the women who went to the tomb. It was seen by Peter and John. It was seen by those disciples on the road to Emmaus. It was seen that Sunday night in the upper room. It was seen for 40 days as he showed them infallible proofs that he was alive. And then Paul said, I saw him myself on the road to Damascus. I was on my way to deal deal with the saints. But the Lord of glory interrupted my journey, and he changed my life. And what I used to fear, I no longer fear. And what I tried to stop, I'm now trying to spread, because I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes. And I don't know if I'm talking to anybody, but is there anybody here or anybody where you are who can say, I saw that truth for myself. I found that power for myself. I've discovered that purpose for myself. And it's because I have the experience of the truth of God, and because I know the power of God, and because day by day I'm discerning the purpose of God. That experience now gives me some hope in this present age, because God's truth and God's power and God's purpose, it will prevail. That there's nobody that can stop my God against right-wing nationalists, against my God white supremacists, against extremists, against pastoral accommodation, against nationalism, against political calculation. God's truth and God's power and God's purpose, it must prevail. It must prevail, because no lie can last forever. It must prevail, because truth that's sent to the ground has to rise up. It's got to prevail, because I read the end of the story. I read Isaiah 61:11. For as the soil makes the sprout come up, and a garden causes seeds to grow, the sovereign God will make righteousness and praise spring up among the nations. I read the end of the story in Micah chapter 4, where Micah says he'll judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will there be any war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. I read Isaiah chapter 40, verse 40 and verses 4 and 5. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked places shall be made straight, and the rough places made plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. I read Revelation chapter 21, and I heard a loud voice come from heaven saying, look, God's dwelling is now among his people, and he'll dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God will be with them, and he will be their God, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, no more weeping, no more crying, for the old order has been passed away. He's coming on clouds. Kings and kingdoms, they will bow down, and every chain will break, as broken hearts will sing his praise. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Nobody can stop the Lord Almighty. Death can't stop the Lord Almighty. Hell can't stop the Lord Almighty. The grave can't stop the Lord Almighty. And so lift up your heads, all ye gates, and be lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle.